talked about race and faith in an international context. His students were interested in our issues related to race and how they might have meaning for students doing ministry studies in Poland. And then our seminary as well has had a series of conversations. We have a Center for Social Justice and Reconciliation that operates out of our Charlotte campus, and a Center for Women's Leadership that operates out of the Richmond campus. And they've been holding a series of seminars, virtual seminars, over the summer on these topics as well, with panel discussions. So it's been a part of who we are during this summer season also.
Oh, good. Well, you're going to extend it to the Midwest. Good morning, everyone. Don't fear, we haven't started. And I are just having an initial conversation, a bit of a warm up. It strikes me that Union Presbyterian Seminary is one of the branches is in Richmond, Virginia.
That's right.
Which is right in the center of issues of removal of Confederate statues, changing states' flags, all those sorts of things are geographically centered there. But let me introduce Dr. Brian Blount to everyone. He is president and professor of New Testament at Union Presbyterian Seminary in Richmond, and the other campus is in North Carolina?
In Charlotte, North Carolina.
And where are you at the moment?
I'm in Richmond right now.
Okay. Great. His scholarship is mostly in the book of Mark and the book of Revelation, so there could be some fun conversations there. And he's the author of 6 books, and this is, I think it's the most recent one, which has this great title. It's one of these that I think is sort of appropriate for some of our local TV shows. Invasion of the Dead, Preaching the Resurrection. Mm-hmm. What a title. Well, this is the 4th and final of our series for the summer on race and faith from Principia. And we didn't discuss about how much time you have this morning. About an hour?
About an hour, yes.
Okay, and what we'll do a little bit is a little Q&A. I'll try to prick you and probe you and get you in a conversation. And then we've got this set up with Zoom. Aaron Rainwater, our assistant dean of students, is serving as the master behind the scenes. So when we go to Q&A from folks, please send in the questions and she will pass them on to us. So maybe half an hour of conversation and then engage. Well, we're hitting almost about 170 folks have logged in. So, George Floyd, Black Lives Matter. How do you say, is this a turning point for the country?
I think it is a turning point for the country. I've talked about it as an inflection point. Others have talked about it as an inflection point in our race relations. We had, as all of us know, a series of situations with racial incidents related to both African-American men and African-American women across the last 4 or 5 years. And those situations were significant. I mean, we heard the cry out of New York, I can't breathe. We've heard situations and circumstances all the way back to situations like Trayvon Martin, where there's been concern. And then, of course, all these multiple issues of relationships with police brutality with regard to African-American males and females. With George Floyd, I think because of that 8-minute and 49 seconds of tape experience where it was impossible to look away, there was, I think, a crescendo moment that things are not changing because, their voices have been crying out, and yet this continues, and now we see it continue in a way where we can't simply say we can ignore it any longer. It's visceral, it's visible, and it, anyone who watched that video can't go away unchanged. And I think that's what happened to our country, and it sparked not just people in our country, but of course around the world. But it was not an individual moment. It was the crescendo, the climax to continual moments of oppressive engagement around matters of race and injustice related to situations like that, that was simply not to be ignored any longer. So yes, I think it was an inflection point. What I hope is that we will continue to press forward. What I'm excited about is the fact that, and of course I'm not an individual uniquely pointing this out, many have pointed out the fact that the protests and the cries for justice that have developed have been multicultural, multi-generational, multiracial. So you see this rainbow of people out in the streets, also in front of their legislators, in front of their mayors, in front of their city council, in front of their police chiefs around the country and around the world. And it's a wonderful mixture of people at this point. So I think something unique has happened, and that uniqueness starts with and develops from what happened with George Floyd.
As a New Testament scholar, is there a unique lens that you have on this?
Well, I have been pushed, looking at the book of Revelation, as you noted. I look at apocalyptic literature, and apocalyptic literature is not just, we think about it colloquially and in popular culture as end of time, cataclysm, destruction, and hopelessness, and all of those kinds of things. Biblical apocalyptic literature, as you probably know, is a literature that is focused on revelation, the revealing of God's future intent in the midst of the present moment. And it's jarring because it's God's future intent that is often at odds with our present activity and present behavior. We're going in different directions than God wants us to go. So when God's intent reveals itself in the future, there's kind of a conflict that develops. What I've looked at is how we might more try to figure out how we align ourselves with God's intent for us as humankind, in terms of the specific case of race relations in this case, but how we might attempt to align ourselves with God's intent. And even if that's going to create conflict in the present moment, we'd be willing to endure that conflict because we're trying to help foster the inbreaking of God's future intent, to help reveal God's future intent by the way we live our present lives. I've suggested to my students across these almost 30 years of teaching that that is what God is doing with Jesus and Jesus's ministry, for example, in the Gospel of Mark. Jesus' ministry is a reflection of God's future intent for humankind, how we are to live with each other. So, the whole idea of equality in terms of relationships with women, the touching of people who are outcasts and bringing them in. Of course, that's the imagery of the lepers, the eating with the tax collectors and the sinners, the people who are considered to be the ne'er-do-wells, the ones you excommunicate from society. All of that represents God's future intent. The problem, of course, is that when Jesus represents that intent in his present moment, the powers that be come into conflict with him, and that conflict ultimately ends up in the cross, the crucifixion. That will happen with us in the present moment as well. And that's why this, conflict often ends up in certain situations. I would suggest that Colin Kaepernick is an example of someone who tries to represent a different way, reveal a different way of how we might live together with each other. And he pays an ultimate cost because of that desire to represent some different revelation of how we can live together as human beings in our world today. So yes, there is a biblical lens for me into all of that, and it's from this lens of apocalyptic, of God's revelation of God's intent and how we can participate in that revealing of God's future intent in our present.
Thinking of Jesus or Colin Kaepernick, to me, the issue of motivation, that spark, or how does one hear the word?
How does one hear the word? I think one has to first begin with reading and knowing the context in which the word develops. For me, that's important I think we're losing biblical literacy. As a New Testament professor, I'm concerned that we don't know the biblical text. We don't know the Jesus stories as well, so that we aren't able to debate from the Jesus chronicles and stories. We just don't know. We depend on secondhand knowledge about them. I think the first thing we have to do is acquaint ourselves with the key literature of our history and heritage as people of Christian faith. That enables us to hear in a unique and different way. So when someone says, well, for example, the biblical materials aren't interested in social justice. So when we talk about someone like a Colin Kaepernick, or we talk about a John Lewis who recently deceased, when we talk about such figures, you know, they're in their world of social justice and political maneuvering and all of that. That's different from the world of the Christian context and the biblical material and the Jesus story. But the more you know about the Jesus story, the more we realize that's not true. Jesus himself was involved in issues, spiritual issues to be sure, faith issues to be sure, that had a direct consequence in the social and political arena of first century Palestine. And that's why the leaders in the political as well as the religious infrastructure in first century Palestine sought to put a stop to what he was doing. They realized his spiritual activity had social and political ramifications. So for me, you won't be surprised, I want people to learn as much as they can about these biblical stories so that they can know how these biblical stories speak to the social and political circumstances in which we find ourselves.
Biblical literacy. How about current day literacy? I'm just going to ask you to explain to some of our listeners Colin Kaepernick, the football player.
Yes. Well, let me just go ahead and say, I am a huge football fan.
Okay.
So from long standing, growing up with my brothers and my father watching football for decades now. So let me say I'm a huge football fan. I knew Colin Kaepernick and those others who knelt with him from a football perspective before they began the protests that he began several years ago on the football sidelines. Colin Kaepernick, of course, was a quarterback for the San Francisco 49ers. He began first by sitting during the playing of the national anthem as a way of bringing attention to and protesting police brutality against African Americans. And particularly, he was looking at African American males, but we now know that, as for example, Breonna Taylor, there are a number of African American women who've also been caught up in unjust situations in terms of brutality by police. But in any case, Colin Kaepernick wanted to bring attention to this. The way he started was to sit during the playing of the national anthem. A former Navy SEAL, I believe it was, talked with him about a more respectful way to present his disquiet during the time of the playing of the national anthem, and he suggested that he kneel. And so he then began to kneel, and then that created a huge uproar. The uproar was created because I guess the political maneuvering against Colin Kaepernick at the time was that his kneeling represented a disregard for the military, the people that served in the military, and the country's attempts through its military action over history to make sure that we protected the interest of freedom and equality around the globe. His point was that he was trying to highlight the injustice that was against the racial injustice that was often endured or continually endured by African Americans in this country. And that's why I was supportive and continue to be supportive of what he did, that he was trying to use his platform. And I appreciate the fact that athletes are able to use their platforms, particularly African American athletes, to talk about racial injustice against African Americans, I don't know why that's a problem. An African American pastor should be able to do that. An African American business person should be able to do that. All of us should be able to do that, of course, for each other. But particularly African Americans should be able to stand up out of their professional situation and circumstance and say, in the context of my job, in the context of my religious affiliation, in the context of my simply living out my life in this world, I should be able to ask people to attend to the things that I believe are unjust in relationship to my people. That's what he was doing by kneeling at that moment to highlight, because he recognized that during that moment, thousands of people in the stadium, millions of people in television were watching him. And so he took that moment to say, as you're watching us get ready to play, I want you to remember that the 75% of people, of football players in the National Football League who are African American, is not just about us playing football. We also need you to attend to the fact that these unjust things are happening to us in our society. That's why I was supportive and continue to be supportive of what he was doing at the time. And of course, as we know, he was significantly well, the belief is that he was essentially barred from opportunity to play in the National Football League. And we now know that Roger Goodell, commissioner of the National Football League, has come out and apologized, not directly mentioning his name, but at least saying that the NFL should have paid more attention to what was trying to have been said during that protest. And of course, one of the gifts of our country is that our Constitution not only protects the right, but also seems to expect that we as a people will protest when we see matters of injustice swirling around us. And I've been alive for, I'll be 64 years this September, and racial injustice has been a part of my consciousness for all of those 64 years.
Are you a Virginian originally?
I am. I grew up in Virginia, about an hour and a half southeast of Richmond, so I'm close to home.
And where is that?
It's a little town, Smithfield, Virginia, and I actually grew up on the land that my family was indentured or enslaved on. And so the farms where I grew up were farms where my great-grandparents were enslaved. And so that's, it's significant and interesting to grow up on that land and know the history of that land and the history of my own family.
My goodness. My father did his original military career down at Fort Eustis.
Oh, is that right? Oh, okay, yes.
Yeah. And when Willie Mays was in the service in the 50s and was stationed down there for 2 years. Dad was a baseball fan, not a football fan. So say, hey, Willie. Yeah. During the time when the military desegregated, Harry Truman, and right after that. Well, let's get back. Your comment about losing biblical literacy. And my sense is, as we lose biblical literacy, and to use a sports metaphor, we're giving up the playing field for others to control the conversation.
That's been one of my concerns, and that's one of the reasons I've been pushing, that little book, Invasion of the Dead, to look at biblical apocalyptic, because my contention in that little book is that popular culture has taken charge of apocalyptic imagery, and it's a biblical image. It's a biblical concept. Also, that there are sects and cults within the United States that have taken over apocalyptic imagery and language and made it into something that I think it was not the intent of the biblical authors. So my concern is that those of us who understand the biblical materials and spend our lives working with those materials, whether it's in church or in academia, as I have been, that is beholden upon us to try to encourage others to learn and study that material so that it can't be co-opted and used in ways that are destructive rather than constructive. You know, you remember the Waco incident of a decade and a half ago or so. That was all built around a misunderstood, from my perspective, a misunderstanding, a misreading of the book of Revelation and its message. It's not a message of contemporary destruction and conquest, and yet that's how it was interpreted, and we know the results that came out of that situation and circumstance. So the more we know about the biblical material, the more we're able, I think, to share God's vision and how that vision lives itself out, particularly around issues like race in our country. But I'm wary and I'm concerned as a teacher of New Testament that people just don't know it. And not just the New Testament, but the Old Testament as well. I've spent my time in the New Testament, so that's why I'm talking about the New Testament.
Well, I'm going to use this moment, since you mentioned the Old Testament, to let our listeners know the connection here between Brian and Principia, and it's not a direct one, but it's one that you'll all go, I get it. And that's Job, our favorite Job, and Barry Huff. Dr. Barry Huff has his PhD from Union Presbyterian Seminary, and Barry was the person to connect us together. So that's our sort of Old Testament connection.
And hello to Barry. I saw he left a message in the chat a little earlier.
Yeah. And he usually, Job often shows up in the classroom, and the kids wonder where Barry is. Let's talk about Mark a little bit. Mm-hmm. What would be the insights of Mark for our era with race?
Yeah, see, let me start at the beginning of Mark, and then as it moves to the end, I think race becomes a key and critical issue for the gospel. One of the things I like to do is to demonstrate how Mark and Jesus and Mark is a boundary breaking figure. And by that, I mean that he trespasses the traditional legal and religious expectations of the people of the time, and that causes a great deal of trouble and difficulty. And for me, the greatest boundary that he crosses in the Gospel of Mark is an ethnicity boundary, one like our race boundary today. He starts with, for example, what is called the first controversy cycle in the Gospel of Mark, which begins in chapter 1, verse 40. And what you need to do is to, as you read Mark from 140 and following, look at material from the Old Testament and look at what Jesus is doing. So what we do is we look at the Levitical codes, for example, and we look at how the Levitical codes understand leprosy. And leprosy, as you know, is a disease in the first century. Based on the Levitical codes, the understanding is that the leper should be outside the camp of the people of God. Now, what I would do is quote those texts, but at the same time I'm quoting those texts, then I jump from those texts to what Jesus is doing with someone who should be outside the camp, who was an untouchable. And the first thing he does in the Gospel of Mark before he heals the man in chapter 1, verses 40 through 45 is touch him. And then he heals him. Now, he could heal him and then touch him, and it wouldn't be a problem. But the tradition, the boundary he crosses is one of touching the untouchable. And then right after that, at chapter 2, verses 1 through, I think it's 12, he heals a man who's been paralyzed. And the issue there is before he heals him, he tells him his sins are forgiven. One of the things we recognize is that, the leaders of the people say to him, to Jesus, well, you can't be forgiven sins. Only God does that. And how does God do it? Through the infrastructure of the temple. Well, Jesus is essentially saying, well, I now am putting myself in the place of the temple. Healing in terms of forgiveness of sin comes through me. After that, he goes and he eats with tax collectors and sinners. After that, he breaks the Sabbath tradition. He allows his disciples to pluck grain on the Sabbath. He heals on the Sabbath. We know I put all that around a situation, circumstance where in the Exodus account, I think it is, the people come to Moses and tell Moses, we found this man who's been picking up sticks on the Sabbath. What should we do to him? They stone him to death as a result of that. Jesus is challenging these interpretations of what I would call these legalistic interpretations of these important traditions, breaking them down so that by chapter 3, verse 6, the leaders of the people, the Herodians and the Pharisees, take counsel together how they can destroy him, because he's breaking these traditional boundaries, these legal boundaries, these ethnic purity purity boundaries. Now that is preparatory for the greater boundary that comes, and that is Jew and Gentile. It's an ethnic boundary that's almost like the racial boundaries with us. Jew and Gentile in the first century, there is this kind of critical tension that we see in the gospel materials. It's not just Mark, it's the other gospels as well. But the important thing in Mark is that Jesus is operating on one side of the Sea of Galilee, and he's crossing over. And when he crosses over, he goes from the Capernaum side, where his headquarters is, to the Decapolis side, the 10 Greek cities. So he's going from Jew to Gentile side, and he's coming back, and he's going forward, and he's coming back. And he's carrying, in essence, the healing power of God that is to the people of Israel, to these other people, these Gentiles. Matthew says, if someone does you a wrong, treat them like a tax collector and a Gentile. I mean, the Gentiles are kind of the other people out there on the other side. Jesus is carrying this mission and message to them. Another thing that happens in Mark is you have these parallel moments, like he will feed 5,000. You remember the story of the feeding of the 5,000?
Right,
And
right.
Mark, he also has the feeding of the 4,000. Well, the feeding of the 5,000 is on Jewish soil. The feeding of the 4,000 is on Gentile soil. They parallel each other to suggest that the gift of God's bread of life, the bread, the nourishment, the feeding goes to all people. And then in chapter 7, there's this wonderful story where Jesus is trying to hide out to get some rest and some restoration. And this woman, a Gentile woman, a Syrophoenician woman, finds him out. And she asked Jesus to heal her daughter who was back somewhere. And Jesus says it's not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. Gentiles were often referred to colloquially as dogs in this ethnic conflict that was going on. And the woman says, well, okay, I take that, but can't the dogs get some of the crumbs that fall from the children's table? And Jesus says, for that saying, go your way, your daughter has been healed. Right before that, Jesus talks about the fact that, he talks about food in such a way that the gospel says he's made all foods clean. Well, what does that mean? All foods clean, that means he's overridden the boundary of the dietary restrictions so that people Jew and Gentile can sit down and have a meal together. So that separation is now broken. So for me, ultimately, the great boundary that Mark is suggesting Jesus is overriding is this ethnic one between Jew and Gentile, which ultimately opens up to him proclaiming in his cleansing of the temple that this temple is a house of prayer for all people. In other words, there are no boundaries. There are no ethnic boundaries between who can come before God in the temple. So that suggests to me that Jesus is a boundary breaker, and the boundaries begin with these traditional rules and laws, but the ultimate boundary is the one that separates people from other people because of ethnic difference. And that's the one that ultimately gets him into so much trouble that he's led to this roll towards, he's called into crucifixion. He has to be stopped because of the kinds of things he's doing. So yes, I think Mark does have a potent message about ethnicity that is very similar to the way in which we understand race. So I think if Jesus's message of the house of prayer is a house of prayer for all people, Jew and Gentile, it's a house of prayer for all people, black and white. As we think in terms of one aspect of race relations in the U.S. today. And I mean, there are multiple, that's just one aspect of it.
Sure.
But for me, that's been important.
Yeah. Before we go to questions, and there's some starting to pop up, how do you apply faith at this point in our time? Because I'm reading in a lot of parallels in the story you just gave that Mark lays out that's a pretty tough storyline.
Yes.
And if we're at a point of inflection now in this nation, it's a pretty tough storyline,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
particularly with the economic and the health issues that are going around. Talk about faith and hope.
Yeah. If I were to go back to the Gospel of Mark and how it's presenting a picture of faith and faithfulness and how we're to respond through our faith, I look at the way the gospel ends, and you know that the way the gospel ends, most scholars think it ends at chapter 16, verse 8, which is the women, you know, the angel in the tomb tells them to go and say that Jesus has been raised, and instead the last word is the women go out and they say nothing to anyone, for they are afraid. And then it ends. And now there's an ending that's appended in the 2nd century to the verses 9 through 20. But most scholars, 99% of scholarship, I think that the gospel ends right there at 16:8. The reason that's important for me is that I think what Mark is doing with that ending is saying, well, the male disciples had already fled from Jesus and abandoned him. Now, the last hope that the message will get out is that the women disciples will tell it, but now they flee at the end and are afraid. So who's going to go and tell the message? Well, I think Mark is saying the reader is now being invited to step in and do what the characters in the text were afraid to do. That is to go and tell the message about what Jesus's life means. So it's an invitation of faithfulness to us as readers of the gospel to finish the Jesus story by retelling, by reliving the Jesus story, and particularly the boundary breaking aspect of the Jesus story, the touching of untouchables, the breaking of the boundaries between ethnicities, race, and our time. So for me, the call of that gospel is that we live out, or we go back to Galilee and we begin and represent Jesus's boundary breaking ministry in our own lives, in our own ministries, in our own professional lives, however we want to. We are disciples who are called to finish the Jesus story. And the hopefulness of that is that just as the Jesus story ends not with hopelessness, but with the empty tomb and resurrection, that the conflict that will happen because we are living the Jesus story, the hopeful message is that it won't end in destruction and death, but it'll end in resurrection and hopefulness. So that's the promise. So if we go all the way back to the Colin Kaepernick kind of story, I want to suggest that Colin Kaepernick isn't the first of athlete who's done what he's done. We remember Muhammad Ali. You remember he made a similar kind of stand during the Vietnam War. He refused to go because his understanding was that that of all the racial things happening to him in this country, why should he go over and fight the Vietnamese since they had done nothing to him? He had endured countless things because of race to him and his family in the United States. So he wasn't going to fight. We remember, I think it was, I can't remember both of their names.
1968, Mexico City.
That's what the other one I was going. That's the other one I was going to remember. The two runners, in both of those instances and stories, it took time, but there's redemption, there's resurrection. Muhammad Ali, remembered as one of the great athletes of our time, a generational figure, and one of the reasons because he stood up. That's one of the reasons he's so admired. Those two athletes in Mexico City, I've seen multiple commentaries and documentaries on them, praising them as examples of leadership and courage. I think in the end that'll happen with, what's already starting to happen. I mean, NFL itself beginning to recognize through its apologies, et cetera. But I think the same thing will happen with Colin Kaepernick. Those sports figures are metaphors that we don't end in hopelessness, but we end in recognition and resurrection and redemption. And I think that can be an encouragement for us as we're acting today. We might not see it, but it will come.
Okay.
And we also have to remember that people like John Lewis and Martin Luther King Jr., during their time, they were by many parts of the country despised, by many in the country despised. What might seem hopeless at the time does bring its own, or God brings to it, a sense of redemption and resurrection. So focus on the resurrection when one is focusing on championing God's cause in the world.
In whatever role we play.
Yes, yes.
Whether it be on the pulpit, on the football field, in the professorate.
Yes, yes. And that's what that book, Invasion of the Dead, is all about. That's why I want us to preach resurrection today, because it has an impact in every aspect of our lives.
Yeah, yeah. Great. Well, let's go to a couple of questions. And this is where I invite Erin to turn on her mic and start sharing some.
Thank you, Dr. Blount, for taking the time to be here. That last discussion actually leads beautifully into the first question here. It's asking, where do you find reason for hope? What is the nature of the hope you find in the New Testament? And how might this relate to the healing of our nation today?
That's an excellent question. Where do I find hope? I find it, I gave a little preview. I find it in the empty tomb because he is not here, he's risen. I find it in the craziest place, the book of Revelation, which is filled with all kind of pandemic, cataclysm, war, destruction. And yet its ultimate message is that God's vision for God's people will prevail. And of course, the end of the book is all about that new thing that is happening, and that new thing is breaking forth in the midst of the old thing even now. One of the things I like to point out is the metaphor in the book of Revelation is a metaphor of the millennium. You know, the 1,000-year reign in the book of Revelation. I don't take that literally. I take that as a metaphor. It's like the eye of the hurricane. It's that calm place in the midst of storm and tribulation that's promised. And in the midst of pandemic, in the midst of racial unrest, in the midst of the kinds of difficulties we're going through in our country right now, for me, the book of Revelation has this promise of hopefulness in the sense of a millennial place of rest and restoration to gain strength and encouragement to continue the battle when the storm, when the backside of the storm comes back into play. For me, that's what worship is. That's what spiritual meditation is. That is what singing hymns is all about. That is what Bible study is all about. They are not ends in and of themselves. For me, they are the times that we regenerate by refreshing our connection with God so that we are able to go out and then rekindle God's vision for God's world despite the storms that are raging around us. So the hope for me is based on this recognition that a connection with God is being developed out of these biblical materials, but that connection is not just in and of itself for its own sake. It's for the purpose of having us live out that connection by how we live out our lives. So that's kind of a roundabout way of saying, I see hope all over the place in the biblical materials. For me, that hope comes from the promise of God's presence in the midst of storm. And I call them the millennial moments.
Thank you.
More often than that.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. This next question is about the Black Lives Matter movement and asking about the platform of that Black Lives Matter movement, specifically what they've written on their website, and asking if you agree with that and do you think Jesus would have?
Yeah. And let me say first. Now, I don't agree with every principle in many cases of many movements, and I think most of us are in that case. There are places where we are in sync and places where we're not in sync. So there are some places where I'm not in sync, but I'd say for 90% of the place I am in sync, and I am in sync because I want us to recognize that that every life matters. So I'll start there. But the fact is, we have lived in a country where not every life has been treated as though it matters. We live in a country where historically historically speaking, through the sweep of our country, and we need to include from 1619 forward with the first slaves who come to Jamestown in my part of the world here in Virginia, not every life has been valued. Not every life has mattered. What Black Lives Matter, I believe, is trying to say is that Black lives matter as much as every other life in this country. And we have not recognized that in the past. We are calling upon all of us to recognize it in the present and in the future. Black lives also matter. We know that white lives have mattered throughout the history of this country. Black lives also matter. And in contexts where Black people are being persecuted in unjust ways, whether it's by police or by others, in those circumstances, it is right to stand up and say, these lives also matter, and I want to do everything I can in my power to make sure that these people with these lives also have equal opportunity to live out their lives in the way that others have that opportunity to do so in this country. The civil rights movement, I believe, was all about the matter of Black lives mattering in the voting booth, in economic situations, being able to sit at a food counter, not having to have separate but unequal situations and circumstances in terms of segregation. I lived through segregation until the period of going to high school. So all of my elementary schooling from kindergarten to grade 7 was lived in a segregated circumstance. That circumstance told me that Black lives didn't matter as much as white lives. And therefore, Black lives are not going to be accorded the same kinds of opportunities and infrastructure in terms of educational resources as white lives in the particular situations where people like myself were going to school. I couldn't go places that others could go. There were segregated beaches. There were segregated water counters. My parents, I remember driving up to Philadelphia where my grandmother lived from Smithfield, Virginia to Philadelphia. We couldn't stop, they wouldn't stop to eat because they were afraid of how we were going to be treated in a circumstance to go into a restaurant. Or I remember the very first time I went to a McDonald's when I was growing up, when we were traveling to Philadelphia, because my parents were no longer afraid that something might happen to us or be said to us because we were going into such a situation and circumstance. So when they were packing all of this food in these coolers for us to make this drive, it took about 8 hours at that time because we didn't have I-95. I thought it was because it was a picnic. I later learned it was because they didn't want to stop to eat elsewhere. They wanted to carry the food because they were afraid of how we would be treated. As our lives didn't matter as much, in other words. So yes, I affirm with all of my energy and intensity the motto that Black lives matter, because Black lives also do matter in this country, and we have not been treated as though we matter equally. We still are not treated as though we matter equally with other people in this country. So I stand firmly in that position and circumstance. Would Jesus have been there? You know, I'm always careful as a New Testament professor to tell people, tell students, don't make that easy jump from, what would Jesus do? Because, it's very difficult. The context of first century Palestine is very difficult to make the jump from there to here. However, there are places where there are parallels. Is Jesus treating lepers as though they matter in a world where lepers did not matter? Yes. Is Jesus treating women as though they matter in the same way that males matter when he calls them to follow as disciples, when they are in Luke 8:3, people who mentor and fund his ministry? Is he in that case saying those who have seemed to matter less, are they mattering also to him? Yes. We know that children, for example, were considered to be in first century Palestine low on the social totem pole, so that they're to be really kind of seen but not heard, in many cases not even to be seen. And yet Jesus pulls them in a very important moment, in one of the gospel moments, forward and says, if you're going to get into the kingdom of heaven, you've got to be like them. So do they matter? Yes, they matter. They matter so much that if you can't be like them, you can't be in the reign of God. When we talk about people who are considered to be ne'er-do-wells who have earned our social reprimand, tax collectors who cheat their own people, or sinners, or people who are looked at as sinners in that environment. And these would be, I think in this case, Mark is really looking at sex workers in this situation and circumstance. Jesus reaches out to them. Their lives do matter. So, and then of course I've talked about Gentiles, and their lives do matter. Jesus seems to give an indication throughout his ministry that people for whom or through whom the lens of the law and traditions of the people are seen to be less worthy, Jesus seems to treat them as though they matter as much as everybody else as far as God's view and purpose and perspective in the world. So because of that, I would say that Jesus would stand on the side of those who are crying out that Black lives matter.
Thank you. I do see in the waiting room, we've got Carol, there, your hand is raised. I'm just gonna let you talk in case you have a question to ask.
It was an accident.
Okay.
Thank you.
No worries. I also see that come out. Your hand is raised. Are you there? I've unmuted you in case you have a question. No.
Someone over in the chat box made a reference to the Good Samaritan. And I thought that that was an intentional selection in that parable.
Yes, that's right. That's right. And you know, in that case, you know, he's trying to suggest that Samaritan lives matter, and they matter so much that they teach those of us in the Jewish tradition how we can live more faithfully our own tradition. That is an ethnic situation and circumstance. I'm not sure how many of the students are aware of the Samaritan situation. But to give a sense of why that's an important story, we do know that from the Old Testament materials, Israel was conquered. Before it was conquered, it was split into two kingdoms: the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. The northern kingdom was conquered by the Assyrians, and then later the Babylonians conquered the southern kingdom. When the northern kingdom was conquered, the Assyrians intermarried with many of the Israelites from the northern kingdom and created kind of a new kind of race. When those people resettled, they resettled in Samaria. They become the Samaritans. In the first century, the persons who were the descendants of the southern kingdom of Judah often looked at these Samaritans as not really pure of ethnicity or pure of faith, because their faith had kind of also been intermixed with Assyrian traditions and other traditions, faith traditions. So they were looked down upon. And so when Jesus uses the Samaritan as the example of righteousness and right behavior and God, the kind of behavior that God wants revealed in our world, he's pretty much, you know, doing what he might have done in, let's say, 1840, and using an African-American and a white Christian and saying, well, the African-American who's been enslaved, the African who's been enslaved acts more like what God would expect of God's people than the white slave owner would act. And that would, of course, be outrageous. And it was just as outrageous to use a Samaritan because of who the Samaritans were and how looked down upon they were looked down upon at the time. So that story is another one that that suggests that I think Jesus would have been on the side of the Black Lives Matter movement.
Thank you. I have another question over here in the Q&A asking your thoughts about removing Confederate statues and that kind of thing, and how you're approaching that issue.
Yes, whether or not I guess is the question whether or not I support taking them down, I want to know what the specific of the question is, so I'm answering the right question.
It's just a general question, what your thoughts are, and maybe how it's maybe not the act of it, but maybe how it's healing or, bringing any resolution for people.
Oh, yes. Well, I agree that it doesn't necessarily bring resolution for everyone immediately, because there are those who obviously want the statues to remain, and for them it doesn't bring healing, it brings anger. I think in the long run it will bring healing and wholeness, because it's a recognition that the statues were placed, on Monument Avenue in Richmond around the turn of the century, the turn of the last century, 1900, 1910, as a way to solidify the moves that were developing with regard to Jim Crow and segregation, to reinvigorate a sense of white supremacy in Richmond and in Virginia. So statues created with that intent in mind, it's impossible for them to represent wholeness and nurture for a broad community. They represented a sense of wholeness only for one aspect of the community ever. I have always thought that they were problematic, and am very pleased that we are moving in a direction where they are coming down. Most of them are now down. One of them is still the Robert E. Lee statue remains because of some lawsuits that have developed. The governor, however, wants to bring it down, and I think once the resolution of those lawsuits happen, that will occur. I think it is ultimately healing, because you cannot have communal healing where symbols that represent hatred toward one aspect of your community remain in a public space and remain celebrated. And that's what those statues have represented for African Americans, and that is the intent behind the statues as they were established. And when one goes back and looks at the record in the Richmond Times-Dispatch, the newspaper, when those statues were put in place, it was clear that there was an intent behind them, and it's clear what that intent was. You can't have communal wholeness while that intent remains codified in the way in which those statues loom on Monument Avenue. So I believe in the end, it will bring wholeness to have new representation of what our community stands for on Monument Avenue, and that will ultimately happen. And I would say that right now, even right now, there is a sense of celebration and a sense of appreciation, and a sense of moving toward communal wholeness and nurture already developing, even at this early stage with the statues coming down.
Thank you. I have a question that was emailed in. The email says, very encouraging message. I have friends who tell me the New Testament is too hard. They're not strong enough or good enough to live up to it. It takes courage to do what you've said to do. What can we say to those who feel they're not strong enough to face the persecution?
Yeah, that is a very good question. And I have wrestled with it in my own teaching and in my own living, as a matter of fact. The message is a difficult one because it calls us to live out God's expectations in the present. I can point back only to what I've said already, and that is the promise is one that God will redeem. The promise and the hope of resurrection is the gift for those who stand up and witness. We are right, I think, to be concerned and to be a bit anxious to try to live out Jesus's message. It is a difficult message in a world that often moves in directions away from Jesus's intent. But the more we stand up the more likely it is that the generations that follow behind us won't have to make those kinds of decisions. So it's not just us living for ourselves to make the world better for us. It's also living to make the world better for those who come behind us. And our sacrifice oftentimes, well, not oftentimes, I think our sacrifices in our present moment make it possible that people in the moments who follow us will have an easier time of it. And I'm hopeful that our connection with each other is one of the things that helps us take courage to make the sacrifice in those moments. I can't make it easy. And you know, I've said that in sermons, I've said that in lectures. I can't make the New Testament easy. But I think I can explain it and make it understandable. And the more understandable it is, I think the more likely it is we are to take courage because we believe that God is standing with us and will redeem us. That's what I have. I know that cannot seem like enough, but that's what I have.
Thank you. Here's another one. Thank you, President Blount, for the vital and inspiring insights that you've shared with us today. Would you be willing to speak more about the cultural interpretation and how it can inform our reading of the Bible and our challenging of systemic racism today?
Yes. As a matter of fact, you know, I could do a whole seminar on that because I teach a course on cultural interpretation of the New Testament and why our context influences the way we read and understand the biblical material. So my first response to that is to recognize that who we are, where we come from, how we think, who our family is, how we've been raised, how we've been educated. All of that influences ultimately the kind of person we are, the context we bring to our biblical reading, and that influences how we draw meaning from the biblical text, which therefore means that people who come from different racial backgrounds, different cultural backgrounds, different geographical backgrounds will often see something different in the text from us because of that different context. What I've been trying to do in that cultural interpretation course is to help students begin to realize we read differently because we are reading from different places, and then recognize that we need to work to be able to hear what others are saying from the context in which they are reading and interpreting the text. That doesn't mean we agree with them, but it means we at first at least understand where they're coming from, which enables us to begin a conversation that will ultimately either end in challenge, confrontation, or growth. I hope it can lead to growth, but the growth will often come through challenge and confrontation because we disagree, but we at least recognize how we get to the interpretation and meaning of the text that we get to. I think that's important as a starting place to begin communication and conversation. Openness to hear someone else is, and openness to hear the other is one of the ways in which we learn to see the text differently from how we've seen it before, and also one of the ways in which we begin to develop pathways to a more mutual understanding of the text that opens up the biblical word in ways that we might not have seen possible before. So that's a really compact answer for what I spent an academic career working on. My dissertation was on cultural interpretation of the Bible.
Aaron, I'm going to jump in. We're getting real close to the hour. I know one of the questions had to do with Black churches and white churches. Tracy Blackham, who we talked about, made the comment that the most segregated time of the week in America is Sunday morning.
Right, right. And of course, yeah, of course, that's an observation that comes, I think Martin Luther King Jr. made it in some of his early sermons. And I think John Lewis also noted that decades after he made the observation, we're still at that place, that we haven't made a great shift. One of the things I want to point out is, again, looking at the book of Revelation, what is God's intent for humankind? And can we reveal that intent in our present moment? And the book of Revelation at the end, in the new heaven and the new earth, and the new Jerusalem, the new temple, every tribe and tongue and nation and people are streaming in. In other words, it's a multicultural, multi-racial, multi-ethnic, multi-people. It's a diversity before God's throne. If that's the way God intends God's future, we need to be working to do everything we can to make that the present moment, to realize that future in the present moment. And we're not. So it's not just an indicative statement that it's the most segregated hour. It's an imperative challenge and charge to us to do something about it. And it's very difficult to make that transition. Every time we go into a church and everybody is like us, we are indicted by the vision of God's future. Let me say that, which means that we ought to be doing everything we can to work toward transforming this present. So when you sit in a church, and if you sit in the church and you're comfortable and everybody looks like you from a racial, ethnic perspective, then that's an indictment. One should not feel comfortable in that circumstance, because that's not the intent, the future intent of God from any biblical perspective, Old or New Testament. Given that, what are we called to do? I think there's a question that comes out of that statement. What are we called to do, recognizing that statement? And I think you know the answer, but here's again that question that was raised a little bit earlier. That's difficult, and that's going to cause problems if you do try to respond in a positive, meaningful way to that challenge to live out that future reality in the present moment. Are we strong enough to do the kinds of things, to call people, congregations, to make the kind of changes and adjustments necessary, so that we can't say that 2 decades from now, that the worship hour is the most segregated hour? We've got some work to do, and it's hard work. And I can't say it's going to be easy work, but it's the right work.
Brian, thank you. We've taken an hour of your time, and it's mid-morning here in the Midwest and early morning on the West Coast. And I'm guessing from some of the names I've seen, we've attracted friends and alumni from across the country, about 200 or so. Now, I know you've been a pastor,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
I'm going to ask you, just without any preparation, would you end with a benediction for us?
Oh, yes, I'd be happy to do that. And let me say, John, it's been a pleasure talking with you and having this conversation. I've enjoyed it deeply.
It's been a privilege. It's been a privilege. Thank you.
And now may God's grace go with us as we go forward from this virtual place together, in this virtual community together. May we feel God's presence and witness moving with us as we move forward to witness in God's world. May we go forth to finish the Jesus story. Amen.
Amen. Dr. Brian Blount, thank you very much. Thank you all for joining us. We promise there are going to be many more conversations in the coming months.
God bless you.
God bless you. Thank you, Brian. We'll be in touch.
All righty. Thank you, John.